we don't have the digestive enzymes in our body to be able to digest it until it's cooked. So when you cook it, it denaturates the protein to a certain level, then that it breaks it down to a level where we actually do have the enzymes to digest it. So slamming those egg whites, I believe it's around like 50%. Scientist coming at you with Brandon again in another on our series, optimizing muscle protein synthesis. So this is the second one in the video. If you haven't watched the first one, please do so. So in this series, we're going to talk about what are amino acids, protein quality, the different scoring systems for protein, and the impact that leucine has on muscle protein synthesis. So with that, get us started, Brandon.
Absolutely. So first off, we need to lay the groundwork of what amino acids are. So they're just the building blocks of protein, and we have to have some understanding of which ones are which. So first and foremost, there's 20 amino acids total. 11 of them are considered non-essential, meaning our body makes themselves, and we don't necessarily need them from diet. While 9 of them are considered essential amino acids. 3 are considered branched chain amino acids. Those are things like leucine, isoleucine, and valine. And then lastly, we have conditionally essential amino acids, such as glutamine, for example. Dealing with severe illness or burn victims, glutamine becomes essential in that process. So some of them are conditionally essential amino acids. Now, once we understand that, we can start to get into protein quality.
Let's stop here for a minute, because there's companies that sell BCAAs, essential amino acids, and so you know, the BCAAs, they're not complete. They don't have all of the amino acids in here. Another thing I'd like to people is on the essential amino acids, we covered this in a prior video on Are You Getting Scammed, where we talked about scams around protein and touched on the fact that many of the essential amino acid, they're not actually full spectrum. They appear to be on the label because they've got the names, but some of, one in particular, that is really essential, and some of the other ones are basically at microdosing levels and not anywhere near where they need to be to balance to provide you the needs. And really, at the end of the day, they're just selling you a more expensive BCAA. So this is what they're selling you on the label. They've marked it up and saying it's this. So if you want to see more on that, check out our video in regards to protein scams.
Absolutely. One other thing to note on that too is that for a protein to be considered complete, it needs a certain amount of each essential amino acid, which is kind of one of the main limitations behind some plant proteins. A lot of plant proteins, a lot of protein sources that are very common for vegans, for example, are incomplete in at least one essential amino acid. This is extremely common. This is why vegans, vegetarians have a little harder time actually hitting their daily protein goals. Yeah. So that's why it's so important. It doesn't mean
that's not a viable diet, but you actually have to do a lot more work to have an effective vegan. You can't just go and say, hey, I'm going to eat this. You actually have to understand the nutrient needs and make up for areas that you're lacking, because otherwise you will struggle. So if you want to have that diet be effective, make sure you're doing your research and understanding that you're getting all the components that you need. Absolutely.
So next thing I want to cover here is protein quality. So what is protein quality? It's just considering the digestibility and quantity of the essential amino acids within each and every protein source. So what we have to understand is not all proteins are created equal. Some proteins are much better bioavailable for our body, but also some proteins have much better essential amino acid content than other protein sources. So there's a few different protein rating scales that we've gone over the years. For example, the one that's been really common the past 10-15 years is PIDCA's Protein Digestibility Corrected Amino Acid Score. Big acronym there, but the one that we're converting to lately has been Digestible Indispensable Amino Acid Score, or DIAS. And the reason why is because DIAS has a much superior way of measuring bioavailability, but also the scores aren't truncated. So for example, with the PIDCA scores, as Duffin's pointing out here, the best score you can get is 100 or 1, which is very, very limiting because a lot of protein scores out there are actually well over that. So 107, 120, whey protein and milk protein concentrate and casein, micellar casein, for example, are all over that score. So it's hard to differentiate higher score proteins with the older scale here.
Stop right there. Yep.
Exactly. And on top of that, the bioavailability consideration as well, with PITCAs uses a very outdated form of measuring bioavailability, while Diaz uses a much better form of it, which is why there's big differentiation with all protein sources.
Now, this is now in use for about a decade, about 10 years or so.
Yeah, the database is still kind of getting built up. It's still kind of converting to Diaz. It's a long process, but yeah, absolutely.
But we still see a lot of people referencing this. So
exactly.
Just be aware. You could use what data you want to support, depending on what scale that you want to look at.
Absolutely. And one other thing I want to cover here is that another reason why bioavailability is so important is we get into the topic of egg whites. So Duffin, you want to take this one?
Yeah, so I can't remember how many years ago, but it was really popular for everybody to slam containers of egg whites. Get my Whole Foods, and super cheap. There's actually companies out there that literally sell flavored egg whites as their protein source. And eggs come up, they score really well on the old scoring system. It's perfect at 100, I believe. So nothing is better than an egg. There you go, cheap. Now, bioavailability. We don't have the digestive enzymes in our body to be able to digest it until it's cooked. So when you cook it, it denaturates the protein to a certain level, then that it breaks it down to a level where we actually do have the enzymes to digest it. So slamming those egg whites, I believe it's around like 50%. In addition to that, not only, but the other 50% that you can't digest is causing maybe not digestive issues, but your body is not processing it well, and that can cause issues with lethargy, brain fog, all sorts of stuff like that following that. So people that have slammed them, you may not notice if you only have 1 or 2 egg whites worth of it. Again, that's in the raw state. Cook it, and you can digest that much easier. So that's massive reason for understanding why the bioavailability has a huge impact on this.
Absolutely, yeah. And to this day, I know so many people out there that just pour egg whites in all of their shakes.
Yeah, and so, and this is also, I use the word there, denaturates. A lot of people hear that in regards to protein, think that's a bad thing, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's actually starting that process to allow you to be able to digest and break that down easier. But yeah, just slapping pure raw egg whites in there, you're only getting about 50% of it, and too much of it can cause some issues for some people with that that isn't being able to be processed by the enzymes in our body.
Absolutely. A cooked egg is going to have a digestibility score in the mid 90s, if not upper 90 percentile. It's very, very high. It's very, very digestible source of protein. It's also very cheap, which is why people absolutely love it. But at the same time, with egg whites, you're just pouring in a bunch of stuff that's 50%, or some studies have shown less than 50%, digestibility, which is absolutely terrible. It doesn't get much worse than that.
Yeah.
And the answer isn't pouring more over the top, but either, because again, we can start to talk about the lethargy effects and other things of that nature that could come with that. So it's probably better to just cook your egg. So that's why bioavailability is so important to talk about in relationship to maximizing muscle protein synthesis. So yeah, I just wanted to really cover on those things here. And another thing I want to touch on here is with the differentiation of scores, we can start to see some more separation.
Here's one here. Look at this, 120. 120. What is this? That's your 80-20 protein, by the way, if you're not catching that. So where we talk about where we've dived into those videos about that ratio being really important and how they work synergistically together, it's not just the timing of that that gives you this great window of 6 to 8 hours, but the fact that it drives up this protein score, this availability, this amount of aminos that are going to be available in your bloodstream. So that's really important. Another thing I want to talk about as we're on this is not looking at this going, this is where I want to focus and I'm going to only have this, right? Because it's the highest score. You need to have variability in your diet. So there's a number of studies that show that staying with a single source protein, and the studies definitely show the morning is the most impactful for this, for the first meal of the morning particularly, that it can develop intolerances. Not saying it will, but it has the highest possibility of doing so, and does so fairly frequently. And I've experienced myself this, and it happens to be with the egg example again, not the egg whites at this time. I think I used to be on the bodybuilding diet back in the early 2000s, would wake up, cook myself like 10 eggs every day for years on end. I'm a man of discipline. I'm like, this is what I'm gonna do, and that was my first meal. And I started having some negative effects after a while, and finally realized that I was developing an allergy to eggs. Ended up having to take a year off of them. If I had eggs, I would get like physically like just unwell. You could see it in my face, my color would change, I'd be lethargic, I couldn't, and so it took a year off, and now I can still only tolerate about, a certain number of eggs, and I can't do a massive amount. So my point here is that you want to have multiple sources. So particularly for breakfast, like 3 sources. If you don't, what you're going to want to do is maybe every 3 or 4 months, switch to a different protein source if you're relying on that single source. This also drives home the point of like, don't rely on supplementation for your primary. This is where whole foods become so important, and this is why we push, we sell a protein powder, right? That we push, you get your majority of your protein from your diet and supplement. And again, that's why the 80-20 comes in great, because it becomes an incredible supplement with that long window. So it fills the gaps, which is what supplementation should do. It doesn't pace the foundation of your diet, right? But the 80-20 blend versus the milk protein concentrate, we get the same bioavailability, but then we're pulling from 2 protein sources. So we're getting 2 of those in this. Like I said, I recommend getting at least 3 sources of protein, but some people start like really getting like pea protein and they just focus on that. So just word of note with this, have a lot of sources, okay?
Absolutely. And the last thing I want to start to cover here is going to be the idea of leucine. So leucine is oftentimes described as the trigger for muscle protein synthesis. It's definitely the most important amino acid for muscle protein synthesis, and it's one of our 3 branch chain amino acids. It's a very, very important one, and different foods are going to have different contents of leucine. And one other thing I want to describe here is the fact that when it comes to our essential amino acids, not all of them do we need the same amount of. So for example, leucine, we actually need about 10 times the amount as amino acid like tryptophan. So very important to note that as well. Certain amino acids deserve a little bit more attention to looking towards getting into your diet consistently when it comes to optimizing muscle protein synthesis, especially because this one's the trigger for that. Very, very important to discuss. Now, one of the things to talk about here is that when we're really trying to optimize muscle protein synthesis, and leucine being described as the trigger, we need to make sure we get a certain amount of it at every single meal. Now, there's a little bit of debate on the exact amount, but 2.5 grams and above is generally the kind of range that people talk about as what is needed to optimally spark muscle protein synthesis. So making sure you get at least 2.5 grams. Some people say 2.7, some people say 3, but the fact of the matter is, as long as you're getting over 2.5, you're going to be a pretty good spot to get that trigger of muscle protein synthesis and actually optimize that process for your body and occurring new tissue. So yeah, it's one of the most important things to touch on there. Anything else to cover there, Duff?
Yeah, in my experience and how I've looked at that is making sure, like, especially you're in the bulking phase, right, where we're taking in a lot of calories, trying to add some muscle. What we want to do is make sure that in those meals where you're getting a lot of carbs and proteins, that you're looking at that leucine content, because we're going to use that to trigger muscle protein synthesis. We're not necessarily looking at trying to retain our muscle and get lean moment. So we're trying to trigger this. And so in those phases, you're typically doing that a lot around your workout window, either before, during, or post, right? So you're trying to trigger muscle protein synthesis around this window. Again, as a whole, we're looking at the 24-hour period, but I'm bringing that up because a lot of times people are putting those large calorie dumps around that time. Make sure if you're triggering that, you've got enough leucine in there, okay? So that we're getting that response and not just throwing those calories in there and not stimulating MPS as much as we could.
And one last working example here I'd like to talk about is that back when I tracked things and I only looked at grams per meal, one of the mistakes I'd always make is just focusing on grams per meal. And a good example of this is I've had 50 gram plus protein content meals where if you really start doing the math on it and looking into it more, their leucine content may be less than 1.5. So just because you're getting a certain amount of grams grams of protein in a meal does not mean that you're actually getting enough leucine or a good enough protein sources to optimally spark muscle protein synthesis. Yes, grams of protein is the most important to cover. Yes, is a great thing to start with, but that does not mean in itself you are actually sparking muscle protein synthesis optimally. So we also have to look into it a little bit deeper, consider digestibility, consider the quantity of amino acids, but also consider the leucine content of the meal to actually do the best job we can at this facet of getting bigger, stronger, or whatever you want to get towards.
Thanks for joining us in part 2 of muscle protein synthesis, and look forward to joining us for part 3 coming next.